everybody, and thank you for joining our Focusing Freedom webinar. It's part of a three-part series on school policing. We can see that our attendees are joining us, so I think we're going to wait about 1 minute as folks get settled and figure out their technology and make sure their audio is working. If you are having any trouble, you can send a question through the chat box, and someone will be able to try to troubleshoot with you what might be the problem. So again, we're going to wait probably 1 minute before we get started with our presentation. All right, I see people are getting settled and ready to go. So again, thank you for joining our webinar today. This is part one, as I said, of a three-part series. This one is focusing on organizing against police in schools, and it is presented by the Dignity in Schools campaign. We will be sharing to everybody who registered for this webinar information on the last two parts of the series. Part two will be focusing on talking about police in schools and school safety, so that will be communication skills related to both talking to the media, but also different audiences in your school and community. We also will have part three, which is focusing on getting to removal of police in schools from where we are now. So our agenda today, we have about an hour and a half blocked off. We'll start, and so about an hour of that will be the content, and then we're going to leave about 30 minutes for Q&A. So definitely write down any questions you may have. You could share them in the chat box if they kind of urgently need to be answered in the moment. Otherwise, we will wait until that Q&A towards the end. First, we'll start off going over police in schools and the impact on students. So we'll hear a review of the history. We'll hear about racial disparities in the data on school policing and the intersection with disability and gender. And we will talk about national trends and incoming threats. Then we're going to go over DSU's Counselors Not Cops campaign, an overview of what our platform is and what support we have available for local campaigns. And then we will talk about lessons learned from organizing on the ground led by students and parents. So we're going to hear from Freedom Inc. in Madison, Wisconsin, and Education Rights Network in Pittsburgh, PA. And actually, Youth Justice Coalition is going to be our first presenter. They're going to talk about their work in the beginning. And as I said, we're going to do a Q&A at the end and then share some information about other work in the fight to remove police from schools. So that's our agenda for the webinar. We're going to get started with a review of history, police in schools and the impact on students. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim McGill from Youth Justice Coalition.
Good morning, everyone, or for some of you, good afternoon. I'm with the Youth Justice Coalition, and we've been tracking the history of the school to jail track, as well as trying to, as everybody is, fighting back around criminalization of students, school push out, and the presence of police and militarized policing in schools. And just really honored to be with all of you today. If you see the second slide, not the one with the two mouths, but the second slide, kind of runs down why we call it a history of a school to jail track, as opposed to what we've heard a lot, a school to prison pipeline. We believe that school to jail track is actually a better term, more accurate, because it's part of the long-term tracking in U.S. schools, going all the way back even before the nation was founded, where whole populations of students, of young people, were seen as not needing education, and that education was always created for the benefits of other agendas and not for the needs of young people. So people have been arguing tracking since the very beginning, and we feel that's like just a more historically a better term to use, more accurate. There's four tracks, four themes that we see throughout public education creation of public schools in the United States that you see reoccur over and over. And three of them really complement each other, and the fourth is really more of a community grassroots pushback against the first three. The first is that schools were always created to meet the needs of labor in terms of capital needs. Both pre-industrialization and post-industrialization, people got the education they needed to be a working class. It was never about getting most people into college. Only the elite had a college or university track education. And I think that continues today in most of our schools. The second was from the very beginning, it was a promotion of conservative Christian values, Christian fundamentalism. And we always hear about this separation of church and state in our public school system and in our governments in general. But that's actually not the case. The history bears out that from the very beginning, it was public schools were created to promote conservative, particularly Christian fundamentalism. The third is social control, to have young people and communities in general that were patriotic and had strong allegiance to the nation, and questioned less and less the policies of the United States. And so this kind of view of, if you're questioning the United States, somehow you're unpatriotic, is something that for sure schools were used to push. And then finally, community organizations, particularly organizations that have been treated badly in schools, have consistently created their own schools or done community organizing, as all of you are, to push back and create schools that are more run by community, owned by community, even the buildings being used by community, or creating their own alternative school settings as a way to push back against the first three themes in public education. You can go to the next one. Thank you, Natalie, for changing them too. So when you go to the first kind of trend you see from the early 1600s, when schools were first created, is that young people are seen as Satan, savages, and slaves. Those are the labels that are used. For white youth that are coming through, again, these are Christian fundamentalist communities that are leaving Europe, particularly England, to settle in the colonies to colonize what's now North America. They saw children as being born as spawns of the devil, and you'll see that more in the next slide. And then for Native youth, they were seen as savages, uneducable, and not needing education. And of course, African youth bought by force, and indigenous youth initially too were enslaved. And so that was the label given to young people, and the theme that people that were in bondage not only didn't need education, but education was also a dangerous thing, because it gave people more impetus to free themselves, to organize, etc. The original sin was what the Puritans believed in, and we see this in our schools to this day. The belief that children were born as spawns or close to the devil, and that the role of society and family was to take Satan, wrestle Satan out of the child. So you could see in our schools, you go to the next slide, you'll start to see how the schools were created from the very beginning. The first public law to create public schools was the Old Satan Deluder Act of 1647 in Massachusetts. And again, Satan Deluder means to trick Satan out of the child. And so from the very beginning, we had this close bond between education and the church. And the reason that you hear this term, separation of church and state, was because one of the original people pushing for public education believed that certain sects of the church had more involvement than others, but it was never about separating church from schools. And so you'll see in the next slide how churches were set up from the very beginning with strict discipline, the belief that teachers are all-knowing and that students are kind of empty vessels that are just waiting to be filled. Schools from the very beginning looked a lot like our schools now. Rows of students in the first schools even looked like church pews, and were very uncomfortable, and our desks today still in rows, very uncomfortable. People were humiliated if they misbehaved, much like young people are put into in-school suspension or pushed out of school altogether. The idea of putting young people that had any kind of disciplinary issues with the teacher in a corner or publicly shaming them as part of our public schools from the very beginning. You could go to the next one. Thanks, Natty. And so the other thing is that as the colonies get established, you start to see this argument around school tracking and who should be educated versus who doesn't need education, and that education is also a dangerous thing in the hands of workers or in the hands of enslaved people, in the hands of indigenous people. And so these arguments start to come about from the very beginning, and tracking is part of our school system from the very beginning. Even in the Puritan established schools, you had right away gender-based differences, where whether in church or schools, girls were treated very differently than boys. Women had no voice in community. And of course, people already know that women who spoke out, or men who even spoke out in their defense around having a role in community, having a voting role, having a role in even speaking out to your own husband, were either banned from communities or in the worst cases, killed, assassinated by the state. So the earliest debates around tracking that are really publicized and written about are between Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. And Jefferson argues that everybody should have a university-based education. Of course, Jefferson was not arguing that enslaved people would have access to school. So the arguments really here weren't about, are indigenous people going to get education, are enslaved people going to get education, but it was definitely about white working class youth, white people who didn't own property, would they even have access to education? And Jefferson argued that everyone should have a classics-based education, kind of a college prep, university prep education. Franklin argued that the purpose of schools was just to build a working class, and that people would only be educated in the skills necessary to be the workforce for the new country. And of course, Benjamin Franklin won out, and what we got was schools that prepare young people for the workplace as they're needed. And so throughout U.S. history, you see this over and over again. The first Indian boarding schools were established about the same time, 1614, by Harvard University is the first one, and other schools in the Ivy League system start to establish these Indian boarding schools. And they rip young people away from their communities and families and culture. They cut their hair, they dress them in Western dress, they punish them for speaking their own language or practicing their spirituality. And within the first couple of years of young people being taken in that way, most young people die. And it isn't through disease, which was also wiping out Native populations, but mostly people attributed it to kind of a cultural shock or heartbreak. And there is now psychologists who define this as in refugee camps, what's happened to children when they're ripped away from community, family, and roots. And this system of boarding schools is then adopted 100 years later 200 years later in some cases, when you look at Harvard, by the US government. So when the Indian Wars were happening and Native peoples were fighting back against the US military, and the debate in Congress was whether do we wipe out Native populations, which happened through massacres and military war against Native populations. But the other argument was we can also not wipe out Indian populations, but whitewash them. And so the person that's most famous for doing this, you could go to the next slide, is General Pratt. And you could see it, I think. Yeah, there you go. And so General Pratt was part of the Indian Wars in the 1800s, and he established, took the concept of Indian boarding schools that the Ivy League had created, and then took it nationwide through government-run boarding schools. And children were taken oftentimes states away from their families. They oftentimes never made it back to their communities. They were kept for years away from their families, again, forced to cut their hair, etc., punished if they spoke their language, punished if they practiced their spirituality. And the term he used with Congress was kill the Indian, save the man, that the idea that you could whitewash and erase a native culture. Schools, if you go to the next slide, were not boarding schools, and majority, wait, hang on a second and we'll see a picture in a minute, but the majority of those schools were not education. The majority of the day was in work settings. So all those schools had factories, and Native children were forced to work in those factories and make money for the schools. In the African-American community, people that were enslaved were punished severely if they were reading or if they were taught to read, including if Black people taught people to read, they were usually punished by death. It was considered key to keeping people enslaved was to keep people unable to read and unable to communicate with each other, particularly when enslaved peoples are coming having known a lot of different African languages and not necessarily being able to communicate in the beginning. Education and a common language was really powerful tool in people's hands. So Black people created midnight schools in the woods to hide their education, their learning from others. eventually started to establish kind of underground schools in communities. And Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth argued, as well as other people, that Black people should be able to speak for themselves, fight for their own liberation, even to the point when Frederick Douglass was told by white abolitionists, you need to speak and act more like a slave in order to fit into kind of a stereotype of how they wanted him to present himself. And he not only fought back against that, but became the leading orator in the abolition movement, published his own newspaper, and encouraged other African Americans to speak for themselves. And as schools were established by Black communities in the North, many of them were burned down. So this is not just something that happened in the Southeast. Even in so-called freed states, Black education was not honored, wasn't promoted, wasn't supported, and many Black schools were burned down. So this tracking conversation comes up again during Reconstruction after the Civil War. And Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois argue that Black people now freed should be, and I put freed in quotes, of course, but with access now to education, should be able to pick what track they want to be on, what their future is, should be able to have a university-based education and practice the law, the medicine, education, etc. Booker T. Washington argued that the Black community, particularly in the South, but throughout the nation, needed to be trained as workers, agriculture workers and technical workers, factory workers. And so again, the argument that really gets promoted and pushed by the government is Booker T. Washington's argument. And it does establish what are now the Black universities throughout the South and now throughout the country, historically Black universities and colleges. But and many of those have professional tracks now, but at the time they were mostly vocational tracks. So it definitely told African American students that the majority of the resources that were going to go to them and the majority of opportunities they were going to have would be in agriculture or mechanics or skills. And so again, this kind of promotes again this idea of tracking. By the 1800s, youth are seen as cheap labor, and the public schools are only created so far as young people are needed to have some kind of skills to fill the workplace. And so you have this huge influx of immigrant youth, first from Ireland during a huge wave of immigration from Ireland during first to poverty and then a forced starvation because the English were taking all the food during the potato famine. And as children, you can see in the next slide, more and more children were working on the streets and working in and living in the streets. And also the majority of students throughout the country from the 1800s to the 1930s had no access to education. Most were workers. So you had factory workers, coal miners, steel miners. Most Black youth were still in agriculture, whether they were enslaved or after the Civil War, forced to work in slave-like conditions in agriculture. Most white rural youth were also working in agriculture. You see the picture there of a Native American boarding school, and those boarding schools existed all the way up until the 1950s. Majority of Native children were taken away from their families, so this wasn't like a brief period in history. The foster care system also ripped millions of Native children away from their families. And you see a picture of children working in the coal mines in the bottom left-hand corner. So whether you were white or children of color, most children did not have access to any education. As industrialization happened, they needed a slightly more educated workforce. So you start to see this push for elementary education. And if you go to the next slide, it'll talk about kind of the founders of like a more massive public school system across the country. The first, and a lot of us have public schools named after this fool. I never even knew who he was until I started researching this. But we all went to like Horace Mann elementary schools in our communities, or we had Horace Mann middle schools in our communities. He was the first Secretary of Education in 1837. And he said that the main reason for schools is to create an industrious class of women and men who obey the law and are diligent in their work. And so that's when we start to have schools that look and operate like factories, with a bell that rings every 45 minutes or 50 minutes, with huge brick infrastructure, where people are just kind of routinely going from class to class and getting only the basic education. And again, not a college prep education. And most people have no access to high school or middle school. This is just elementary school education. It's not until the 1930s and 40s that most people across the country have access to high schools. And that's only a brief period, because then by the 70s and 80s, you're dismantling a lot of public charters. So what we think of as universal public education for everyone, K through 12, is only a few decades of our history, which also kind of surprised me, very shocked me, really. If you go to the next thing, this is kind of the godfather of classroom management or harsh school discipline, school push out. And this guy, I never heard of either. I don't think I've ever seen a school named after him. But I think the classroom management that he promoted in 1907 is still the basis for most education programs across the country. And I think most of us see his kind of beliefs in our schools. William Chandler Bagley argued that no one who studies educational theory can see in the mechanical routine of the classroom the educative forces that are slowly transforming the child from a little savage into a creature fit for law and order. And I know you can read it, but I just think it's important to say out loud because I think it's really the basis for most of our classroom education and containment and control of students that happens, as opposed to schools that are created to think about how do we promote people to come up with their own decisions, their own view of the world, to debate issues. So I mentioned this fourth trend, which is people taking over schools and public education in order to create their own liberation. And obviously, you have in the left-hand corner, the Black Panthers created their own schools. The American Indian movement created their own schools and took indigenous practices back to reservations and Indian country. The Brown Power movement, whether it was through the Young Lords in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, or the Mecha student campuses on the West, or the Brown Berets or the Black Berets in Colorado, they all promoted the creation of public schools that were more indicative of what communities wanted and more run by communities. They started to push for people of color to be on school boards. In the case of the Brown Berets and other student leaders in East LA, they created the East LA high school walkouts and walked out, stayed out of schools until their demands were met. In other places like the Black Panthers, like the American Indian movement, like the United Farm Workers, they created their own schools as alternatives to the regular public school system, where people were honored, their traditions were honored, their culture, their language, and they got a better quality education. And we still see that too. And so based on everything that was happening in the 60s and 70s, the student movements and the youth movements led primarily by people of color, you see these three people come out of LA and their policies sweep nationwide. First is Nixon. He declares a war on drugs, but he also declares a law and order backlash against 60s movements. Ronald Reagan was governor at that time in California, picked up those policies in California, and then as president, really built the school to jail track that includes militarized policing in campuses and the kind of way our schools have. They used to be built to look like factories. Now many are built and operate a lot like prisons. And then the third person is Howard Jarvis, also out of LA, who starts the anti-tax movement, the white flight movement. It's a racist movement that says white middle-class people, wealthy people, shouldn't be paying for quote unquote public schools and other benefits to largely poor people and people of color, is how he argued it on much more racist terms. And so you start to see what happened in LA has been proven in the congressional record, also happened throughout the country, although there hasn't been as much congressional debates on it, that with Reaganomics, you have the taking out of any factory jobs, union jobs out of most urban and rural communities. And you have Iran-Contra, where in order to put down Central American wars, you take drugs from Iran, you cycle them through the streets of American cities, you create a drug economy and replace factory jobs with a drug economy. Of course, you've taken out the 60 movement leaders through incarceration, through assassination, and through kind of paying people off with contracts. And so the only kind of industry that is replacing that is the drug economy. So you start to see a lot of young people being labeled as gang members or otherwise quote unquote criminals. So by the time, you can go to the next slide too. I'm sorry, I'm just throwing all this to you, but by the time President Reagan gets to the White House, he appoints William Bennett as his U.S. Secretary of Education. And that's the first person who uses zero tolerance in the context of schools. During the war on drugs, Richard Nixon had first used the term zero tolerance in terms of how they were going to deal with drug users and drug sellers. But the term is then by Reagan and Bennett put into public schools. And so that's when you start to see that in order to get public education dollars from the federal government, you have to abide by their demands that people be automatically expelled, not only from schools, but often school districts, for 5 main charges, which includes weapons and drugs in schools. And it's these kind of zero tolerance policies that start to push massive school push out and also massive policing in schools. And so schools start to look, if you go to the next one, you start to see the takeover of schools and school security even by local police departments, whether it's school districts hiring their own police departments, creating their own police departments, like we have the largest school police department in LA Unified School District, the LA Unified School Police Department, or you have school resource officers on campus, often armed, or you have contracts with local municipal police or local sheriffs to handle the policing for those schools, or they have kind of routine stops and searches around schools, ticketing around schools, and the ability to enter schools at any time. And you start to see an erosion of school discipline that's handled by deans and other school personnel, and instead see where school departments take over school security. You have more probation officers than counselors in schools, let alone more police than counselors. Schools already are looking like prisons, begin to look even more like that, where you have this huge technology around surveillance, metal detectors, random searches, searches of lockers, even drug sniffing dogs in many schools, many of our schools for sure. And this starts to lead to massive push out and arrest of students. Of course, this happens to youth of color overwhelmingly. So you also start to see by Clinton's term where school shootings are taking place in a more noticeable fashion, where the media is picking up on them, starting with Columbine in 1999. But you don't see the same lockdown of schools in places where those school shootings are happening. In fact, when we looked at school shootings going all the way back to the 1700s, and we could send that data to you too, we saw that 98% of the shooters, 96% of the victims were white, but the schools that are getting militarized and metal detectors, et cetera, are schools of color. And Lupita, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Okay, cool. Lupita's going to talk about what the alternatives are that we've been working on in terms of peace builders.
Yeah, the first thing I just want to say is the difference between a peace builder and a police officer. You can already see that they have two different uniforms. Obviously, a police officer has a strictly uniform that you can identify them. They have all these different tools around their belt. And a peace builder is somebody just casual clothes, either is already familiar with the community, knows majority of the people in the community. They have the ear to the street, which is the police officers. They listen to a command. Somebody calls them in. They're on the clock, so it's a 9 to 5 job. They have 40 hours a week. And a peace builder is on duty 24 hours. Anybody can just call and see and solve a problem. If it's such in a need, then they can call at night. Our peace builder Carletta, I know she answers her phone anytime. I've called her a couple of times just to talk, and she answers her phone. A peace builder does not have a gun, does not have any other weapons. They de-escalate with their voice conversations, which is a police officer has a taser and a gun and a baton, and we already know how the de-escalation goes. Um, uh, it costs thousands of it costs. I don't know. I know this information is not updated, but you can see the difference between their salary. And one thing why JC has been working on a campaign is from rearranging 5% from the law enforcement budget to go to youth, and it can create from 5% can give us $50,000 to have a peace builder. So that's something that we've been pushing. A peace builder at Chuco's. When I was there being a student, I actually really felt comfortable walking in, and she's greeting you, saying hello. She already knows a day that I was having a bad day. Um, she gets to know everybody, so now she's not just there to as a paycheck. I would say she actually wants to talk to people. So yeah.
And just real quickly, to add to what Lupita was saying, The other things we've worked on in terms of removing police from schools is decriminalization. So we were part of a campaign that ended truancy in LA Unified schools. And then YJC looked at fare evasion. That was the #1 cause of ticketing in and around schools and on the way to schools for our young people in LA County, 10,000 tickets a year. So we eliminated fare evasion first in LA County and then created a state law to eliminate it.
Hey, Kim, you guys have a lot of static coming in. I don't know if you switched. Oh, there you go. Much better.
Yeah. And maybe, yeah, this one. And then AB Assembly Bill 901 is a bill we have now. We were able to get probation officers who were engaged in voluntary probation of 21,000.
There's really a lot of static. I don't know. Can you put yourself on mute for a minute, Kim, to see if it's you? And if there are other panelists who are not on mute, can you put yourselves on mute? Okay, it went away.
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you.
So the other thing we found was that there was 21,000 young people in LA County that were on this thing called voluntary probation for school-related matters. They were reporting to a probation officer for things like low grades or attendance they'd never even been to court for. And so we were able to eliminate that in LA County last year, and then this year we have a bill to try to eliminate that statewide. So I would just look out also for the kind of mission landslide that law enforcement's engaged in, where they're now saying that they are the new, school security. They're the new counselors at schools, quote unquote. They're running after school programs, quote unquote, or they're running programs for young people that are struggling in school. All of that kind of stuff we're seeing is, I think, very dangerous. And not only are they taking the majority of the money would normally go to after school programs and counselors, that's a much cheaper intervention, but also a much more effective intervention. But most seriously is that contact with law enforcement labels young people, and then they are much more likely to be involved in more serious parts of the system or later incarceration.
All right, thank you so much, Kim and Lapita, for that presentation. So we will have Q&A at the end, so please hold your questions. We are going to move to the next thing on the agenda, which is talking about racial disparities in the data. And Harold Jordan from ACLU of Pennsylvania is going to talk about police in schools and the impact on students. Can the other panelists mute themselves if you're not speaking right now? There's a little bit of an echo.
Good afternoon.
Right.
This is Harold Jordan. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to talk about some trends today, what's going on with police in schools, why the issues are important, and how to think about the data and who's impacted by it. So I want to just take about 10 minutes to sort of go through some things, give you some things to think about, and then later we will put up and identify some resources that folks can take and run with for their future work. So police in schools, why is the issue important? Well, first thing, that in the last 20 years, more young people have become exposed to police in schools in their everyday lives in schools, just going to school every day, than ever before. And we also know that schools with high percentages of Black students, schools with high percentages of low-income students are more likely to implement strict security measures. That means not only police, but that means metal detectors, that means other kinds of hardware and surveillance in schools. That's another trend. Also, there has been an increase, at least for the period that we can document, from the 2013-14 school year to 15-16 school year, an increase in arrests and contacts with law enforcement, roughly 3% increase in arrests as best we can document. This is nationwide, and a 17% increase in referrals. And I'll explain in a minute what we mean by arrests and referrals. But in some states, like California, for example, student contact with police, referrals to police has gone up, it went up even more dramatically, upwards of 40% during that period of time. And of course, we can expect to see more, and we have seen already in the post-Parkland era, more contact between students and law enforcement. And the other thing I wanted to sort of highlight here is that also means that there's more justice system contact for young people. Arrests, citations, diversion programs, and these voluntary probation programs that Kim was referring to, but diversion programs that require monitoring or the admission of guilt, and things that generally create some contact with the system and some record that could possibly likely stick with young people. So these are some of the trends today, but they add to what have been ongoing problems for, I would say, the last couple of decades. The lack of accountability where police are in schools. And when I say lack of accountability, I mean really two kinds of things. One is lack of control over the daily activities of what police do in schools. So this notion that police are not involved in everyday school discipline, everyday school conflicts, that has been largely unenforceable in almost all places. And the second kind of lack of accountability is that there isn't really good accountability when things go sour, when there's a conflict between police and students. It's hard to get accountability there, as it is on the streets. Physical and emotional harm to students, violations of basic rights, whether it's around searches, privacy, interrogations, things of that nature, the kinds of rights that we push very hard for people to be protected in the civilian world when people interact with police. There are similar problems in schools. And of course, the misallocation of resources, more resources going into cops rather than student support resources and personnel. And what I want to focus on in just a minute is sort of the disproportionately negative impact by race, disability, and gender, and show you in just 1 minute what some of those trends are. How do we understand arrest and referral trends? When I say referrals, I mean referral to law enforcement regardless of the outcome, where law enforcement is called on young people, they have some contact with law enforcement, even if they're not arrested. So you need to look at both of those. What happens when kids are arrested? What happens when kids are referred to law enforcement? And, what we find is that the rate, and that is the increase in contact and increase in arrest, are driven both by the regular presence of police in schools, where they're in schools on an everyday basis, and by police being called into schools frequently on certain children, even when they are not stationed there full time. Regarding the first one, police being in schools full time, what we know is that schools that have police full time have arrest rates that are roughly 3.5 times that of schools that don't have police full time. And with regard to the second issue, there are some districts and some schools where police are essentially called in all of the time, even if they're not stationed in schools as school police officers or SROs. And in fact, in a state like Pennsylvania, that if you looked at the school districts with the highest arrest rates, that a good percentage of them are going to be, the majority will be ones with police in schools on a regular basis. But a high percentage of them are also going to be schools where there's no police officer that's technically on staff, but police are called into the schools all of the time. So we need to look at both of those, although it's generally true that arrest rates are higher, substantially higher, in places where there are schools, in schools where there are police full time. One thing to understand is that arrest rates and arrest data is generally underreported, and you can't completely rely on official data. So part of our advocacy has to be to gain access to correct data, to make sure that agencies monitor what's going on in terms of contact with students and police. That is part of our struggle. I would also say that we need to watch out for recent legislative and district level initiatives to empower non-police security guards. In fact, there's even a bill in Pennsylvania now that would allow districts to have them have firearms, non-police security. And in fact, they do in some places, and that's a growing trend as well. And there is some research that suggests that when you have more security staff and you especially have more police, that suspension rates go up and expulsion rates go up, although I would say that there's not enough research that's been done in this area, but there are some indications that it's not only driving up arrests, having police in schools, but it also drives up school district administered discipline. But overall, student arrest rates have not declined compared to the decline in overall out-of-school suspension rates. So there's clearly a specific piece of work to be done. I mentioned a minute ago that that when we talk about the ways in which students and police have contact with each other and the implications of that, we often measure that in terms of arrest and referral to law enforcement. Well, the concept of arrest is pretty clear and straightforward, but referrals to law enforcement are something sort of broader than that. They include arrests, they include the issuance of citations, or any situation where police are called in to dealing with young people in some way. And there have been attempts, certainly by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, to collect that broader information, the broader data on student contact with police, even when it doesn't result in arrest. And so that's the distinction between school-related arrests and referrals to law enforcement. But referrals to law enforcement are supposed to be included in, arrests are supposed to be a subcategory of referrals to law enforcement, which measures a broader contact between students and police. So in front of you is a fact sheet that we developed at the ACLU Pennsylvania that looks a little bit at race and gender and disability on one page. Pennsylvania, as it turns out, is a fairly typical state when it looks at these patterns. So the person who's most likely to be arrested is a Black boy with a disability under IDEA, right? But Latinx boys and many other students are also high in terms of their arrest rates. But the patterns that you see there, while they're not the same in every place, are fairly typical in this country. The major exceptions being states with substantially larger Native American populations, Native Alaskan, and Native Hawaiian population. And we're going to see that in just a minute. But first, let's take a look at sort of gender and race patterns. Next slide, please. Gender and race. And this looks at both arrests and referrals. Referrals is the darker line, arrests are the gray lines, where you see, when you look at girls and arrest and law enforcement contact rates, you see interesting patterns where Black girls and Native American girls and Native Alaskan and Hawaiian Pacific are substantially greater than some others. And the Latinas, the number for Latinas is going to vary depending on, it will be higher than that in some states than in others. But this is one way of looking at it, of gender and race. Let's look at, for a minute, race and disability. And the black and white slides here are from the national data. They're not Pennsylvania data, they're national data. And so I said in the beginning, when I gave you a view of Pennsylvania, I said, well, these patterns hold true in most states, but in states with larger Native American populations, you will see something a little bit different. And this slide has a good illustration of that, where you see that the rates for both Black boys with disabilities and Native American boys with disabilities, their contact with police and the arrest rates are extraordinarily high. So that's another way to look at it. And then finally, one of the things that I want to explain a little bit is how you look at impact. There is a certain kind of customary and casual way that we talk about this in our school to prison pipeline reports and in our work that's helpful, but not truly revealing of the problem. So we often talk about the rates of arrests for group X is 5 times the rate for white students and things, that's a typical comparison that's made. But that comparison can be misleading, especially if you're trying to look at trends across time and across space. When I say across time, I mean, if you clearly, whenever you want to do any work on school discipline reform or police and students, you want to know, is a problem getting better? Is it worse? Are arrest rates going up or down? And using these ratios in that way over time can be deceptive and misleading in terms of understanding the true impact and the severity impact on certain groups. Similarly, if you want to compare one state to another, using those kinds of ratios that Black girls are arrested at X times that of white girls in that state and compare different states, that can be misleading as well. So let me just give you an example to think about. In Pennsylvania, black girls are arrested at 5.25 times the rate of white girls. California, it's 5.5 times. But the difference, there's a dramatic difference in the arrest rates of black girls between California and Pennsylvania. Roughly almost it's 5.7 or 6 times, roughly 6 times the rate. So that clearly the black girl arrest problem is much more severe in Pennsylvania than it is in California, which is already too severe. And we also know that when we look at different parts of the state, that there are certain pockets of the state where the arrest rates are especially high for black girls. So for example, in Allegheny County, 32% of the black girls entering the juvenile justice system from anywhere in the county, there's like 43 school districts, come from school-based arrests in one district. And that is the single largest feeder of black girls into the juvenile justice system in the whole county, is the arrest of black girls in one particular district. And so when we look at impact, we have to go from just these general ratios of X time, this group experiences something at X times the rate of that, and look more specifically at their impact measured in other ways, and to make sure that we look at the absolute numbers and the absolute rates to understand the severity of the impact. So our challenges are briefly to monitor, change, challenge overall security policies regarding police, school resource officers, and school security, even when they're not sworn police officers. We have to monitor how sort of the mandatory versus discretionary involvement of reporting requirements and involvement of security staff in school matters. And then we have to address how school resources are used to make sure that they're used for student support resources, for community intervention workers, instead of just for security officers and police. The ACLU produced in February of this year a national report that analyzes some of these trends. Here's the cover, the link to it, but it identifies some of the major trends in terms of how resources are used. 1.7 million students go to schools where there are cops and no counselors. And there are similar patterns when it comes to social workers, nurses, and school psychologists. Thank you.
Thanks, Harold. So yes, we're going to move on to Nicole. And I think, Nicole, actually, that static might be coming from your phone. Is there any way that you could quickly switch phones, or?
I can try. Can you hear me all right now?
It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad, actually. So maybe what I will do is skip over your part for now and move to the Counselors Not Cops piece, and we can come back to you, because, yeah, it's pretty bad. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Thank you. So we're going to skip over that, but come back to it. Sorry, Harold. I have you on again to talk about our platform for our DSC Counselors Not Cops campaign.
So Dignity in Schools, as one of its major initiatives, a few years ago initiated this Counselors Not Cops campaign. And we did the work in consultation with the 100+ organizations that are part of Dignity in Schools campaign. I remember meetings in a church in Los Angeles where we debated what folks in our communities were saying about the use of police in schools and what we as a coalition should be saying about it and doing about it. And so we came up with this platform, which was approved by our membership, that has 3 basic components. One, in the regular presence of law enforcement in schools. And that includes sworn police officers, but it can also include other kinds of school staff, especially where they are armed, other kinds of security, especially where they are armed, and can have a negative impact on young people. That also means controlling the presence of outside police in schools. And so the basic concept there is that the default position should not be that law enforcement is in schools, that should be the exceptional situation and a narrow exception. That should not be the default way that schools address young people in the everyday school environment. The second element of the platform is to create safe schools through positive safety and discipline measures. And that includes the kinds of things that Youth Justice Coalition folks were talking about, school staff that are community intervention workers, that are from that community, that understand those children and work in their best interest. But the basic idea, though, is that you want to create a school that is a warm and welcoming environment where there's some degree of trust. And that cannot be a school whose emphasis is on creating a kind of militaristic environment. And then the third element of the platform has to do with what happens or what should happen in situations in which law enforcement is called into schools. And there, the important thing is that their role should be limited, that students' rights and the rights of people in the school should be respected, and that there be some safeguards so that that does not result in inappropriate or harmful contact with young people or others in the school community as well. Those are the elements of the platform. We also produced, we being the Dignity in Schools campaign, produced a resource guide that provides more background on what is meant by these three elements of the platform.
Thanks, Harold. Yeah, so I can go into some of the resources that we have available for organizers or other folks who are working on this issue. So that slide that Harold just went over is a summary of our platform, but each of those three pillars is expanded in the platform itself, and Safari is sharing some each of the resources I'm talking about in the chat box, so you can click on those links and see them. And I am seeing some questions too. So this is being recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel, and we also will send out the slides with the live links as well, so you can have all of it. So we have the platform, which has lots of detailed demands that can help you, especially if you're working on a local campaign and trying to figure out exactly what it is you want to be pushing for. That's basically how, most of our resources work is we look at them kind of like a menu where you can look at it and pick the pieces that make the most sense for addressing whatever harm or issues is going on locally. So that is the detailed platform that's available. And then, as Harold said, we have the resource guide. So that has a bunch of research to support our demands. It has some example MOUs, things that are already in place. It has links to things that are in our DSC model code, which is another resource that is available. And that similarly, that is it's our model code on education and dignity. We're actually in the process of updating it for a re-release this summer, and it has a whole range of model policies that address criminalization and school push out more broadly. So most things you could think of, there's something in the model code about it. So we have like sample dress code policies, responses to bullying, things we re-released those earlier this year, and so there's also detailed information about, search policies and avoiding criminalizing infrastructure. So if there's a particular thing that you don't see in the version of the model code that's on the website, you can always reach out and ask me. We may actually be working on it behind the scenes. So or it sometimes is difficult to find things in that. So again, you can also reach out and ask if you want to know if there's particular language in the model code on a particular topic. It also goes over in detail what preventative and positive school climate should look like in terms of what restorative justice elements would be in place, or PBIS, or other types of things like that. So more of the proactive stuff is in there too. We also developed some talking points around arming SROs and other school staff. That's also being put in the chat box. You can take a look at that, and it has links to the research that supports it. And then kind of more in terms of relationships, we can always connect you with organizations who are in similar situations. So obviously people have different political contexts. So sometimes if there's not something that, we can directly help you with in terms of resources, we may know somebody who we can connect you with who could be of help. So those are just some of the ways, but if you are looking for some support, you can always reach out and let me know. All of our contact information is at the end. and also my, I think if you got the registration link, you have my email too. So yeah, we can always answer questions kind of on a one-on-one basis too. So those are some examples of resources and support for campaigns that we offer through our Counselors Not Cops work. So I think now we are good to go back to Nicole, who's going to share a little bit about national trends around police in schools. Are you there, Nicole?
I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm using my cell phone to be clearer than my desk phone. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through a couple current threats on the SRO front. First, a report from the Federal Commission on School Safety, then a little bit on state and federal legislation and its relationship to other policies. So you can move on to the next slide. So first, last year, after the tragedy in Parkland, the President put together a Federal Commission on School Safety, which was tasked with coming up with recommendations to address school violence, in particular school shootings. So one of the recommendations of the report, and kind of running through a couple of different chapters, was increasing the presence of SROs, which we know is not actually shown or proven. There's no evidence behind them making schools safer. But in the words of the report, they said that SROs are best positioned to respond to acts of violence due to their specialized training, which we also know they aren't required to receive, and in many cases don't. And that placement of these trained personnel in schools is effective at stopping school violence because it can build relationships with students. So as we heard earlier, police are often and not in the best place to build those relationships. So those jobs are best left to other skilled school staff like counselors and social workers. But the federal administration is trying to build a record that SROs are in the best place to do this. So this reasoning used in the report has been used to support other federal and state efforts to expand the use of SROs. So you can move on to the next slide. So on both the state and federal level, there have been bills introduced and in some cases enacted to increase the presence of SROs in schools. One example of a federal bill was a bipartisan bill, so I think there was one or two Democratic sponsors introduced to increase funding for SROs, providing that they provide a safe learning environment and act in several roles as counselors, mentors, and as law enforcement officers. So that hasn't passed, but it's just a sign of the way that some legislators are thinking. On the state front, which is probably a bigger risk at this point because there's more of a chance of legislation passing, I included a link to a website put together by the National Conference of State Legislatures that has a really useful tracking tool compiling state school safety bills. So this isn't just SRO bills, but any bills that relate to school safety, so army school teachers and other aspects of this work. So you can explore yourself. It's super helpful. You can look by your state, you can look by subject matter, but just looking at it briefly, since 2017, there were 197 SRO-related bills introduced in 38 states. 27 of them were enacted. So some are positive. There's one in Illinois in 2017 that required more training for SROs, with specifying that the training be developed by experts in youth and adolescent development and education. But some are more negative. For example, Tennessee passed a bill in 2018 allowing off-duty police officers to serve as armed school security officers during school hours. So those are just some examples, but please go through and check out the tool for yourself. And it does show that there are a number of other school safety-related bills that have been introduced in states. Some of these, like arming teachers, and I know this came up in Florida last week, could encourage some legislators to turn towards increasing SROs as a more friendly way of nominally or arguably increasing school safety so they can look like they're doing something and not fall into the more extreme crowds who are proposing things like arming teachers, although unfortunately that seems to be becoming less considered less extreme as time goes on. So that was a very quick overview, but I will be here if there are any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicole. So now we're going to hear from some organizers on the ground. We're going to start with Freedom Inc. in Madison, Wisconsin. We have Joan and Bianca.
Hi, everyone. This is Joan.
And this is Bianca.
Yes. Yeah, thank you all for being here with us today and for allowing us to just share some of our lessons learned doing organizing around removing of cops from the Madison Metropolitan School District here in Madison, Wisconsin. So we belong to the organization Freedom Inc., which is a Black and Southeast Asian organization in the Madison area. So we work specifically with women, girls, young people, and LGBTQ people. Yes, so we can go to the next slide. So yes, so the young people at our organization that are really leading this No Cops in School campaign are called the Freedom Youth Squad. They are our youth leadership team. A lot of them come from different youth programs that we have, and they meet weekly to really deepen their analysis and develop their leadership skills and really strategize on how they're going to get the cops out of their schools. So as you all can see, we have 4 particular demands that the young people are really pushing for and really reimagining the kind of schools that they want from these demands. Okay, next. Yeah, so how we have been really working with our young people and engaging them, engaging their leadership, cultivating their leadership, and leading the campaign. Again, like I said, Freedom Youth Squad are the ones really leading it, and we've been meeting with them at least once a week to really deepen our analysis, get the political education and leadership development, and then also exercising that outside of just our groups, right? And something that Bianca, we were really talking about was there had to be this huge ideological shift.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I can talk about that. So Madison is a very interesting city. It's only 5% Black. And in the Midwest, in our ideas about safety, our ideas about Blackness in particular, and our ideas about safety really had to change within our organization, but also just with our base and with our community. So, for example, we started a Black girls program here at Freedom Inc., and this was about 2 years ago. And when they first came into the organization, we tried to assess their ideas around policing. We already had this police abolitionist ideology and framework, but we were just trying to figure out how to get our people there. So when they first joined the organization, it was we're bad kids and we need the police, right? And now we've seen a shift over these 2 years about our youth seeing schools and police and institutions as problems and not necessarily their Blackness. So I think that's really important. And within our organization, we've done that, but also just citywide, we really put this conversation about policing and school safety on the table, and we saw the city respond and community members respond to it as well. So, I mean, there's always right-wing backlash whenever movement happens, obviously. So we saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of local white supremacists organizing against our work, trying to defund our organization, doing things on social media to make people feel unsafe. But we also saw the community respond in ways that affirmed our work and saw it as an issue, if that makes sense. So we just had a school board election And 3 of the people that were elected to the school board had spoke out in some capacity against police violence in school and made school safety for Black and brown students a part of their platform. And that hadn't happened in elections like the previous elections. So I think that we see that in the ideological shift that's taking place. Like how do we like redefine safety? How do we like center people who are most impacted, Black and brown kids? And how do we create alternatives that are actually healing and that are actually gonna support and benefit our kids?
And a lot of this wouldn't have been possible also without like the direct actions that our young people really did. So this picture that's actually on here is at one of the school board meetings, and the young people took over the school board meeting. So they're actually on the stage, went on the stage and took the seats of the board members and held their own meeting and really talked about what they wanted in their schools.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then on top of like our youth feeling empowered to speak at these school board meetings, we knew that they needed to see on the daily. They needed to see their leadership, and we needed other folks in the community to also see their leadership, right? So these are postcards that we developed for our postcard campaign for asking community members to really continuously be sending out the message to board members that they don't want cops in schools, and to really divest from the police and invest in youth of color. And these are like quotes of all the young people that we work with, that from some of their testimonies that they did at the school board meetings. Yeah. 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 And then another way that we were also engaging beyond just the young people, right, was how we really thought about how do we continue to really engage parents and community, right? So we started to really do teach-ins, like a 30-minute, 15-minute teach-ins right before the school board meetings, to really gather people, to really get them on the same page, to understand, to get them a rough update around like what changes, what are the current updates that are happening, and continuously pushing the demands that the young people are have developed. Next. Yeah, and then beyond that, we also knew that we needed to go beyond just educating our or doing these teach-ins and dialogue with our community. We need to bring them in and have them feel invested and really feeling like they had their hands and their voice were a part of shaping the schools that are best for Black and brown students. So we knew that we needed to have a coalition, a Safe School Coalition, that would consist of all of our allies, all of our Black and brown and Southeast Asian parents, to really be working on and pushing on all of these demands. And then also creating alternatives outside of that too, right? Because we right now, right, like it's been 2 years, we still haven't gotten what we want, but that doesn't mean that we can't create it outside of the schools. So a great program that Bianca really runs that plays a huge role in our No Cops in School campaign is our Books and Breakfast summer program.
Yeah. So yeah, in the legacy of the Black Panther Party and other organizations like Hands Up United, a lot of people have started Books and Breakfast to, our goal is to really invest a lot into our elementary age youth, right? So before they become organizers and before they become leaders, but really giving them like political education as a foundation of learning and literacy. So we try to, really instill values of liberation in them at a really young age. And I think it's been really fruitful in what they're learning and what they're doing and how they identify issues in the world, and how they see solutions in the world. So it's a really good like political education visioning project for our babies, right? Because we can't leave them out of our movement, and they will be our next like cohort of young youth organizers. So we want to give them a good foundation before that happens.
Yeah, so I think that's really some of the things that we've been working on, some of the lessons that we've learned, really engaging our young people from the huge age range, and also parents and community members. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are running a little bit slow on our time, so we hope folks can stay until 3:30, and we will have Q&A at the end. So this is our last presenter, Gada from ACLU of Pennsylvania, who is also a former volunteer at the Education Rights Network. Gada, are you on?
Hi. Yes, and I will be as quick as possible. All right. So if you go to the next slide. In Pittsburgh, our 22 school police officers are actually part of the teachers union, and they approached the teachers union asking to be armed because there is a policy in place that prohibits all school personnel from being armed. Their justification for this was that they are being asked to respond to shots fired while they are unarmed, and that's not safe for them or for students, and that the guns are the tools they need to do their job, and they are the only police department in Allegheny County that are unarmed. The other union members, there are about over 3,000, were not told of the executive board's decision to support the school police in being armed. So they approached the school board and they had them individually meet with a school police officer. And the reason they did that is because if they met as a group, it would have to be a public meeting. And so they decided to meet with them individually. The school police approached the policy committee to bring this up for a vote. The chair and the vice chair opted not to do this. They were opposed to the idea of arming school police, and so they wanted this to just kind of go away. The school police decided to go to the safety committee, which had the most conservative members as the chair and the vice chair, and they were very much in support of arming our school police. And so the safety committee knew that they had to get the support of the policy committee, and there was a little back and forth on this as far as getting it to a vote. And after I'd say probably a few months, the policy committee decided to finally bring the issue to a board vote. But to make sure that this wasn't done without transparency, that it wasn't just quietly voted on, they wanted to make sure that activists, parents, and students and teachers were informed. So if you go to the next slide, Harold met with departments at the American Federation of Teachers who were also opposed to this, and we have the executive vice president step in to speak to the director, that they were still very much in support of the police and being armed. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette published an editorial saying that they support arming our school police. As a result, Harold published an op-ed asking that the school board not arm our school police. At around the same time, I was running for school board, and I got wind of the fact that my opponent was pushing the school board to arm school police. And so I reached out to parents and encouraged them to send letters to the school board members and attend public school board hearings to voice their concerns. Two of the groups that were instrumental were One Pennsylvania and Education Rights Network, and they mobilized their whole network of parents and students to rally, to speak at hearings, to write, and call in. Now, at the time, both the chair and the vice chair that were pushing for this, you can go to that page, were both running for re-election. And because there was so much attention in the media and from parents that were very much against arming school police, they pretty much let it quietly die down for about a year and then brought it back up after they were elected. So in July, our Pennsylvania legislator decided that they wanted to propose a bill as to whether our teachers could carry weapons. So in response to that, our school board passed a resolution that called for sensible gun safety legislation and for school board members simply to affirm that they would not be in favor of changing the policy of arming our school police or anyone else. They convened a policy meeting to hear from experts. So Harold Jordan spoke, Kim Stolfer, who is a very far-right gun activist, a little bit more extreme than the NRA even, and Chief Brown, who is our chief of Pittsburgh School Police, all spoke. Following that policy meeting, there was another public hearing and a rally, and parents across the district filled the school board room to voice their concerns. There was not a single person other than the police who asked the board to arm police. And then after that, the board voted 8-1 to uphold the current policy prohibiting all school board personnel from being armed. So we did win that. And I think the lessons that were learned is that there is work on multiple levels. There's work behind the scenes, speaking to AFT, PFT school board members. We also had a very progressive school board for the most part. They were willing to listen to parents and students and experts. They understood what was at stake, and they understood the impact would really harm Black and brown students. A lot of local action. We had parents, students, and teachers and activists that were very much involved and very much against arming our school police. So they organized protests and rallies, spoke at testimonies, wrote op-eds, and then keeping it all transparent and accountable. So making sure that everybody is aware, understanding that there was legislation that was going to be passed or a policy that was going to be changed, and making sure that everybody that was going to be impacted knew about it. And that's it.
All right, thank you so much, Gada. So we do have time now for Q&A. So folks can type their questions into the chat box through the GoToWebinar. If you are in a place where you're able to talk, I think that we can take people off mute if you raise your hand. Let me take a look and see if folks are doing that. Yeah, so questions for our presenters. I did notice some people got off at the 3 o'clock mark, but the majority of people are still on, just so that presenters know. So most people have been able to stick with us. So yeah, any questions?
This is Liz. I can share an initial question that came in through the chat box. We had a question about if there was any data, and this, Harold, I think was during your presentation, around specifically for Black, Brown, and Indigenous students who are transgender, non-binary, or two-spirit, if there's any data on arrests or other issues for them.
Not really. No.
Yeah,
I would share it if I had it, but not really. I mean, so here's the thing. You know, there's some data on experiences of young people outside with the justice system outside of schools, but there's no school data that I'm aware of that would respond to your question.
Thanks, Harold. And I do think there's been some survey projects done by like the GSA network and others, right, where it was more about students sharing their experiences, but not sort of statistical data on arrests or other stuff.
I think there might be data. I think there might be data in California. It necessarily wouldn't apply to your state, but you could use it as a tool for wherever you're at. You know, to just talk about disparities that I could try to see if it's available and get out to people. I'll see if Natalie, if I find anything, I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can share what I know about data with regard to juvenile arrests, but there's a particular problem when it comes to measuring these things when you're looking at school data.
There's another question that came in. Not sure if folks have any information on this because it's not something that we typically focus on in CSC, but does anybody know about data on post-secondary or university policing?
I don't. This is Harold. It's a fascinating question and it does come up, and I do acknowledge that there's work to be done in that area, but I'm not aware of it.
Is that on the civil rights data collection? Isn't there something about that? Or was that something?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. I didn't think it.
The CRDC is just K-12, and we've actually had the same question here at LDF and have not found any sources of data along those lines. So we would love if other folks have.
And I see Roland, your hand is raised. So I am going to take you off mute so you can answer your question. Roland, can you hear me? I took you off mute.
I clicked on the wrong button, but that's okay.
Oh, no.
I was now typing in the question. I wanted to get you to share the information on California and LGBTQ if it comes in.
Perfect. Okay, we will do. And I'm seeing Fernando has his hand up, so I'm going to take you off of mute. Can you? Oh, you are self-muted now, Fernando. So can you unmute yourself? And you should be able to speak, Fernando, because you are self-muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Hey, North Carolina, some of our school board members claim that they are forced to have a school police or SROs at the high school level because it's mandated by a state statute. I'm wondering if what other states actually are mandated that they have SROs or school police by statute and at what level. One question. The other one is also for that particular mandate, they are getting money from the counseling budget to actually pay SROs that are placed in the schools. So that's a big fight that we have right here. And the last question is, we found out recently that in Wake County, we had 20 different municipalities. So in any given municipality, if a city council member feel like they need to add more police to schools, they can just go ahead and do it if they know how to pay for that. Because at that level, the police departments pay for the SROs, but the school district doesn't have any process to approve those SROs or doesn't have any MOU or anything. Like literally could just budget for SROs and have SROs at any elementary or middle schools that they want. So I'm wondering if other states also have the same type of problems, and if there is any model that we could use to push back or get the school district to implement more like assessment or filtering type of tools, so don't allow the police department to implement SROs.
Thanks, Fernando. Folks have any responses to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is Harold. So I'm not aware of any North Carolina law that mandates that school districts have SROs. There may be laws that provide, well, there are definitely laws that provide some funding stream, but that's not the same as a mandate. So, we run into, so I would certainly like to see it and comment on anything. If somebody has a reference to it, just send it to me and I'd be happy to comment on it and see if that's in fact what the law says. I mean, so the kind of thing that you have in many states, I would say in the last several years, including pre-Parkland, but certainly post-Parkland, is you will have governors, task forces, reports, study commissions that make this as a recommendation, but that's not the same thing as having a law that's passed by the legislature that makes it a requirement. Now, Florida obviously is in a different situation there, where that Florida is the most extreme in that regard. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure, formal and informal, that comes from state governments and state institutions, state departments of education, commissions on crime and delinquency, governor's offices, and safety task forces, pressure to do that, but that's not the same as having a law that makes it mandatory. And that's often misstated or misunderstood by school officials.
Thanks, Harold. And Ananda, too, shared in Wisconsin, they have to have a safety plan. And Laureen has her hand up, so I'm going to take you off mute, Laureen. You are also self-muted too, so if you unmute yourself, Laureen, there you go.
Got it, cool. And so look, just wanted to piggyback really quickly on what Harold said. So although Harold said, maybe it might be misunderstood or misstated by school officials, sometimes it's also intentionally misrepresented. Just wanted to highlight that. And then lastly, I wanted to ask, will we be getting a copy of the PowerPoint from today's presentation? It was awesome, guys.
Yes, the slides and the recording we'll be able to share. And then I think we had another question. We got a couple of good questions. Well, I asked the simple one first, kind of. Does anybody know about any involvement by ALEC, A-L-E-C, and I'm forgetting exactly what that acronym is, but I know that they're like a more right-wing organization that shares model like legislative language. Has anybody monitored that, if school discipline is something that they get involved in? School policing?
I know they've done some stuff on facial recognition, like how they did a report, I think, called How Facial Recognition Technology Keeps Kids Safe. And I know that they have actually done some work to defeat any focus on guns, any focus on gun legislation as a solution to school shootings. That they're so I know that they've done some work on those two things. I'm not aware of what else they've done in this area.
There's another question I want to get to. So that's something, since this is a 3-part series, we can do a little bit of research about that and bring some more information to an upcoming webinar. But somebody asked a question about, are there any states or districts that have a good model to address policing in schools? Anybody want to share some examples of good models? I think there's no place where it's perfect, of course. No place that we'd hold up is like exactly what we want, but maybe there are some examples people want to share of where there's models to adapt.
I would encourage people to look at the policies around policing in schools that DSC members put together a few years ago, and maybe those of us who worked on it and others should come back together to update it. And also young people after Sandy Hook, we had about 90 young people, DSC members across the country, that got on calls and wrote a pretty comprehensive plan from youth perspective and youth workers perspective, what should happen in schools as opposed to criminalization and harsh, militarized policing. And that's also, I think, available through DSC, or I could send it out to everybody again. So I would encourage people to look at those.
Yeah, sorry.
And I
it's on
apologize.
the DSC website. Sorry.
And it's called No Peace with a Peace. Thanks, Harold. And I apologize, I have to jump off for another call, but I just really appreciate this conversation and everyone's work. It was really amazing. Thank you, Natalie, for putting it all together.
Thanks, Kim. So yeah, I know it's 3:30. That's when we said it would end, but we have a backup plan for all of the additional good questions that have come in that we haven't gotten to yet, which is that we're going to move the conversation to Twitter. So there we can share some examples of model policies or districts that are doing some things right. So we can share that on Twitter. We can also share the answer to the question of whether or not data for school referrals by gender and race is available in civil rights data or state data. The answer is yes. We can share the link to that. And then I'll look closely at the rest of the questions and see what else we can share on Twitter. And then if you have additional questions that weren't answered, you can just, tweet at us or email us, and we'll put it in a future webinar. So
just one last thing. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. On the policing policy stuff, we have a page of sample policies on different aspects of school policing on the N0 Tolerance website. So if you go N0 Tolerance, school safety, and you look at policy reforms, there'll be like good policies regarding immigration, good policies regarding, interrogations of students, good policies regarding certain other things, although no one place is perfect. And I'll post that link on Twitter.
Thanks, Harold. So we also just wanted to lift up our work in the context of other work in the fight against police in schools. So folks hopefully are aware of the work that the Police Free Schools work, the We Came to Learn report that was put out by Advancement Project and Alliance for Educational Justice. There's also hashtag assault at that Alliance for Educational Justice have been sharing examples of the violence that has been happening against students by SROs and police who are in school. So it'll often be assault at and then the name of the school where it took place. So they've been really monitoring that and lifting up the examples where they are publicized, because we know there are many that are not. Do the Harder Work is a report by Communities for Just Schools Fund, and the Schools Girls Deserve was put out last year. Girls for Gender Equity, they're doing all kinds of work around that campaign. FixedSchoolDiscipline.org has a lot of examples of some of the model policies that have come out of Los Angeles and Journey for Justice. They have a sustainable community school model that has some alignment with this. And then we also just wanted to share that there are DSC members who are going to be presenting on future webinars who are going to on these the next two, who are going to share in detail about their work. Black Organizing Project, DSC New York chapter, Midwest Center for School Transformation, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, Parents Across America, Portland Parent Union, and Youth on Board. So again, we'll be sending you the information to everybody who registered to get on those additional webinars. And so here is the information for all of the presenters. If you have any follow-up questions, again, you can tweet at Dignity in School for our Twitter handle, where we'll move the conversation to now. And here again is just if you need to follow up one-on-one with any of the presenters. I want to thank everybody for who was on the line to present today, from ACLU of Pennsylvania, Freedom Inc., NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Youth Justice Coalition. Thank you so much for your work and for sharing with us today. And thank you to everybody for joining the call. So yeah, thank you so much for hanging in there, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.